everyone. Episode 7 of the usual team from the NBA side of myself, James, and Ben are joined as normal by Sean Kennedy, Technical Services Manager for Livestock from Florida, and we've got Philippa Wiltshire, Standards and Operations Director at Red Tractor, and Rob Bernard, Partner in Greenside Taylor Hunt, based in Sedgemoor Market. We're going to have a deep dive into farm insurance and Red Tractor later. But first, Sean, we need to start with Blue Tongue. There was another AHDB webinar last week pushing the message to vaccinate, predominantly for BTV3 if you're sort of north of, let's say, Oxford and below Shetland. Most of the, if not all of the BTV8 cases have been in the lower regions of England from Sussex across to Cornwall. Have you got a latest update on where we are, vaccine availability, BTV3 and 8?
Yeah, so vaccine availability for BTV3 remains good. Obviously, we're watching that situation very closely. There probably hasn't been as much uptake as we'd expected at this point in the year. Certainly less uptake than we had seen by this point last year, but there is vaccine available. There's plenty of vaccine available. Obviously, last year we saw a cluster of BTV8 cases in the southwest of England. We've seen evidence that that's overwintered via transplacental infection during the vector low period. So preemptively, I guess, we have bought a volume of BTV8 vaccine in so that farmers have that choice should they wish to use it as well. So yeah, as for BTV3, that is available through vets if farmers want to go down the route of having those conversations and taking those steps to protect their livestock.
And I'm still not surprised, maybe even almost mesmerised at the speed of uptake in vaccine in the south of Ireland from the revelation at the back end of last year, a few abortions, and the uptake there has been incredible. And we still struggle to get the message out here. And I don't know why that is. We still, every week there are cases, dummy calves, empty cows. So I hope we're not heading to a tsunami of cases over the summer, which will challenge livestock numbers again. Bob, what have you heard on the ground in the southwest? Because that's where an awful lot of the cases have shown themselves. Although it's across the whole country, from, let's say, Somerset through Devon down into Cornwall has had a high prevalence of disease.
Yeah, I mean, I have a fairly good news story, really, because I've had very little contact about it. I've only had one client speak to me and say they had a stargazing calf, and he thought that was Schmallenberg, but I've sort of pointed him in the direction of Blue Tongue, and that was a client right up in the middle of Exmoor. But apart from that, I've not had too many reports. So normally people only come back with problems when it's an animal I've been dealing with. So I wouldn't automatically always hear, but in that respect, I've not heard a great deal, which is good.
Yeah, and I think the stargazing calf, we can almost categorically say, Shona, that would be Blue Tongue.
Yeah.
I think you'd have to be highly suspicious of it, and I think that's maybe been the picture across the board. Is you do pick up on these stories of farms with increased mortality in young calves rather, or an increase in stillborn calves, or niggly calf abnormalities where there hasn't been testing taking place, and it's just sort of been accepted as one of those things. I mean, I think in all likelihood, a high proportion of those probably represent BTV3 transplacental infection.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed that we continue to push the message of vaccination. And again, to anyone that's out there that's watching or listening, that if you need or are concerned, contact your private vet. Sean, we're at that time of year and a lot of cattle are outside. What other treatment should we be focusing on at the moment?
In general, having a plan for the grazing season, I guess, is the key thing. Getting vaccines, including BTV, if you do decide to go down that route, before you turn your cattle out. I'm thinking now about parasite control as well. It's been a good spring, and there's lots of grass, but we will reach that point where there are worms around that will challenge grazing livestock, particularly young stock. So I think this time of year is always a good opportunity to look at that holistically and put an annual plan together, really, so that you know what you're going to do or what you're going to test when.
Yeah, vaccinating for BVD as well. Still, especially
Absolutely.
in England as we get closer to what will become a mandatory health and welfare pathway visit, and including the eradication of BVD. The sooner people buy into that program, the better.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's some of the messaging around BTV vaccine as well, is each vaccine stands on its own merit and brings its own value. And I would counsel against perhaps thinking that because you're vaccinating against BTV3, you pull away from vaccinating against another disease, because it's then that you get gaps in protection that can come back and cause problems. So, it's with BTV, it's going to be a challenge for a defined period of time. We're talking maybe 3 years when we'll need to vaccinate. I would encourage farmers to do that in addition to the diseases that they've needed to vaccinate previously, rather than looking to switch it for something else.
Yeah, and for listeners who listen to the Joe Warren podcast, I spoke to Joe last week. Carvin's now complete, and the whole carving went very sweet. There is no issues at all. And his story it's quite sickening, the pain he went through last year, and his estimated losses for last year are £60,000 on a 100 cow herd, and the losses will continue this year and next year as his numbers have reduced accordingly. So, and if you haven't listened or watched that one, folks, I would encourage you to go back and look at it. I don't remember which episode it was, maybe 5, but James is thinking now, maybe 3. Okay, I think it's more than 3, but it's maybe 3 plus 2,
4.
but don't show it's 2 fingers. Yeah, so, yeah, great, right. I think we should, unless anyone else, James, Ben, any comments on Blue Tongue or turnout programs?
I was just wondering if we have any information on the vectors at the moment. Are you seeing a lot of vectors about, or is it they're not busy yet? What's going on there? Do we know?
I think we've crossed the threshold for vector activity, but it will be a gradual kind of build up then. So yeah, I mean, I think anybody who's been out with livestock will have noticed that there are midges knocking around, but that risk will gradually increase as the summer wears on, and with it the risk of BTV as well.
I have seen midges, but my midge identification charts aren't really up to date, I don't think. So I'm not sure which ones they are. But yeah, okay. So
a lot we don't know about them. You know what I do? I go off on whether my old pony looks itchy, because it is culicoides midges that cause sweet itch in horses as well.
I'm bright enough not to have horses, so that's good.
Well, there's a good reason for keeping one.
Yeah, so that could be bright enough and subsequently rich enough, Ben. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, James, cows all vaccinated outside, no issues.
Cows all vaccinated outside, and to be honest, I had my vets here today doing some semen testing on some bulls, and I was chatting to one of the vets, and he mentioned that he'd been to a herd, I think it was about 18 cattle, but they'd only got 15% actually in calf, and he was putting that down to blue tongue, but the farmer was not interested in actually testing and looking for it, which was a real disappointing thing. And they were saying that seems to be something that's quite regular. They're seeing a lot of people having poor scanning results, or people who aren't scanning and then subsequently having poor calving results. And they're saying it's probably blue tongue, but no one seems to want to actually do anything about it, which is a real bad thing, because I think if more people then were to look at it and find it was blue tongue, we'd have a bit more encouragement around vaccinating. So I do encourage people to do it. I've done mine again. And we've not looked back, so I don't think it's a bad investment at all.
I'm not sure how denial fits into business efficiency, but there's probably something there where everyone can learn.
Everyone loves a conspiracy theory, Neil.
Yeah, absolutely. At the same time, if you don't measure anything, you can't manage it. I think it's, and we've, the stories that we've talked about with Joe and others that, have lost 20% of their production, at times where cattle values are where they are now. I accept they're not where they were even 3 months ago, but they are still, in relative terms, almost double what they were 6 years ago. So yeah. Right, Jonah, anything else you want to chuck in the animal health pot?
Nothing else from me.
So we shall now move on to farm assurance. At this point, I am going to declare a conflict of interest, because I sit on Red Tractor's Technical Advisory Committee. I'll still be here, but I may not over-contribute, other than I might throw in a few snippets because RSPCA have released a press statement today on their new standards for farm assurance in beef. And Ben, I think you maybe want to say something similar.
Yeah, I'm also going to declare an interest there. So I sit on the Beef and Lamb Council or board, sector board, sorry, at Red Tractor. I do that because as chair of the National Beef Association, it's my job there to represent the views of beef farmers. And I have been there now for a little over a year.
And we've got the perfect mix for this because Rob was our previous NBA representative on the sector board for beef and lamb. So, yeah, but I think, Philippa, ladies first, if we could get an update where you are with the FAR review and what's new and what's coming. I think today was the first day in situ for the new CEO. Things will be different, at least, within Red Tractor.
Yeah, okay, no, very happy to give you an update. So I'm sure most of your listeners are aware that the Farm Assurance Review published over a year ago now, at the beginning of last year. That was a review into all farm assurance, but obviously Red Tractor being a significant farm assurance scheme, we've taken that review very seriously. We've looked at all the recommendations of the review and I think, are absolutely welcome to the review. We're absolutely committed to delivering positive, tangible change for farmers, and the way in which we can do that is very much through our sector boards, working collaboratively with our sector boards. Obviously, Ben and Neil, I know you're involved in that. I think your input as representatives from farmers is really important in that process. So what we've done is we've also committed to be a lot more transparent about what we do. So all of the work that we've been doing over the last 12 months is very much focused on reducing audit burden and making sure that we've got standards that meet market and trade requirements. It's really important that in doing so, we can provide value back to everybody in the supply chain, and obviously farmers are a really crucial part of that. So I can go into a little bit more detail. I'm sure you want to do a bit of a deeper dive into certain areas rather than me just talk for the whole time.
Well, Philippa, before you do, can you just tell us who you are and
Of course.
what your job description is, how you fit into Red Tractor, what your agricultural background is? Give us some of that deep stuff, and then we can
of course.
more in detail.
No problem. No problem. So I'm Philippa Wiltshire. I work for Red Tractor. I'm the Director of Standards and Operations for Red Tractor. I'm a farmer's daughter, a poultry farmer's daughter. I was brought up on a turkey farm. I've always been involved in agriculture, and actually for the last 28 years of my career, so pretty much most of my career, involved in farm assurance. So most of your listeners will remember Fabble in the early days, pre-Red Tractor. I joined Fabble at the end of the 1990s to run the National Beef and Lamb Assurance Scheme. So although I work for Red Tractor and I cover in my role across all the sectors, making sure that we have standards that are fit for purpose for farmers and for the whole supply chain, beef and lamb is definitely at the core of where I've come from and been very involved in Fabble and then Red Tractor and into the other assurance schemes. It's a real privilege to be involved in the organisation. I feel very passionately about British agriculture and doing what we can to promote British agriculture, and the fact that I can be involved in all of the sectors. And what's really interesting from my position within Red Tractor is to see the significant and different challenges that each sector experiences. And obviously we're here to talk about the beef sector today, but it's fair to say that the whole farming and food industry is going through some really significant challenges. But what we can also see is where each sector can learn from each other. In some cases, some sectors have tried things that might have worked or might not have worked, and we can share that and share those learnings across the sectors. So that's a little bit about my background and what I do at Red Tractor.
Well, thanks, Philippa. Can I get you to explain now as well, who owns Red Tractor and what's it for?
Yeah, certainly. So Red Tractor was set up in 2000. In June next month, it will be 26 years old. It was set up by the NFU at the time, and obviously I was involved in Fabble at the time. So at the time, at the end of the 90s, we had a number of farm assurance schemes that were set up individually in each sector. Fabble was the beef and lamb assurance scheme, but we had schemes in other sectors that were set up. And the primary purpose of the assurance schemes when they were set up in the 90s was to provide a mechanism for farmers to be able to demonstrate the standards that they produce food to, because we had a situation, unfortunately, in the 90s where the consumer trust in food was at an all-time low. So the assurance schemes were set up in the 90s to provide farmers with that mechanism. But there was nothing to demonstrate and show the consumer what the farmers were doing. So that's why Retractor was created in 2000, with a primary purpose to reassure consumers and provide that vehicle through the logo to go on pack to demonstrate and really communicate to consumers these are all the standards that the farmers are meeting in order to produce your food, and therefore to generate that trust in consumers again. And over that period, that trust has come back. We now have really, really high, great levels of trust. And I say we as in the farming industry, not solely Retractor. That was the whole farming industry that has helped to do that. So it was set up in 2000 by the NFU, but it's actually owned, as in the members of the company. There are 6 trade associations that effectively own Retractor. That's the National Farmers Union, the National Farmers Union of Scotland, and the Ulster Farmers Union, because obviously we're a UK organisation. We then have Dairy UK, the British Retail Consortium, and AHDB. So they effectively own the company, but effectively their liability is limited to £1, but they delegate all of the management of the organisation to a board of directors. That board of directors is made up of a mixture of independent and industry directors. It's quite a big board. There's 16 on the board now. And if anybody's interested, obviously all the governance associated with the Retractor is available on our website. But happy to take any specific questions, Ben, if you've got any more.
So I think that there's 2 good things that come out of that, or interesting things for me. And one is the what is it for bit. So it was to reassure farmers, I think was what you said.
So I think it's primarily got 2 purposes. The farm assurance system is the mechanism to allow farmers to demonstrate the standards to which they produce food, and to reassure consumers. So primarily to reassure consumers. That's why the industry needed it, because we had such low trust. So that's primarily why it was set up.
Reassure consumers
that the food that they're buying is safe and responsibly produced.
Thank you.
So safe and responsibly produced, and this is in our Articles of Association when we were very first set up. What is meant by that is food safety, traceability, animal welfare and environmental protection.
Cool, thank you. So that's why, and then the WHO thing, the ownership group. So what we have there is nominally it is owned by mostly farming organisations, but that's only really
farming
nominally.
And food, nominally, yeah.
Because actually the decision-making structure is far more complex. And I think it's probably important as part of this that we explain to farmers, because I had no idea before I got involved in Retractor how decisions were made, or by whom, or why. And I think if we can get those things out during this conversation today, then I think we will go some way to having done our job.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So obviously, there is a main board of directors in terms of the company. As I said, some of those are industry representatives. So wouldn't surprise you that the majority of the owners have representatives. So there's a farming union representative, AHDB, and the supply chain. In fact, what's relevant to this sector is a meat processing representative as well as BRC. But that's 5 industry directors. What we then have are sector directors. So each sector board has a chairman, and each of those chairmen is also a director. And then we have 3 independent directors as well. So an animal welfare expert, consumer marketing expert, and a finance expert. Obviously, to run any board, you need those elements of company governance. But what is really important is what sits under that board. So we have a sector board for each sector, and we operate in 6 sectors, and obviously beef and lamb is one of those sectors. And that sector board is made up of representatives from that sector and the entire supply chain of that sector. So we take beef and lamb, for example. Obviously, Ben, you sit on that board representing the MBA, and Rob before you. We have a National Sheep Association representative. We also have an NFU representative. Then when we talk about the supply chain in terms of this sector, an auctioneer representative, meat processor, a couple of vets actually, no, one vet, and then a couple of retailers. So what you have is the whole supply chain involved in beef and lamb sitting around a table talking specifically about this sector. Where is it that, and how can we look at this sector and what is needed by this sector in terms of assurance, reassuring consumers, providing that value to the whole supply chain. And I mean, I'm interested in your feedback, Ben, but over the last, particularly since the Farm Assurance Review and probably, sort of 6 months before that was published, we very much have, the way we work with the sector boards now is very much to have that open conversation. It's about all of the representatives sitting there and talking collaboratively about how you can address certain issues. Now, with farmers, supply chain and retailers, there'll obviously be slightly different differences of opinion. But I think, the majority are looking to have a profitable, sustainable industry. And actually, there's probably more consensus than perhaps some people would think.
So I'm just going to answer that, and then I realise I've robbed the first 10 or 15 minutes of that, so I'm going to get someone else to come in. But I enjoy being on that beef and lamb board. The discussion is rigorous, I would say. It is forceful but polite. There are differences of opinion, but they're always brought out in a very sensible fashion. And I think that's the way it should be run. I think the chair does an excellent job, so hats off to John Dracup who does that. But there is definitely a different view that would come from, say, the BRC than would come from, say, the NSA or perhaps the NBA or whatever. And so that tension in the room or in the discussion, I think, is entirely healthy.
I would agree with you, and I see that play out in all of the sector boards as well. And at the end of the day, the whole supply chain needs to work together, doesn't it, to have a successful British food and farming industry. And sometimes you need to have difficult conversations and understand each other's perspectives. So I think what the sector boards do is provide that forum for that conversation to happen. And I think, what our role as Red Tractor is to provide that forum. And I think we're, particularly over the last 18 months, 2 years, very much taking the soundings from that group. And there are some difficult conversations and difficult topics, but it's about finding a way through that, doing it collaboratively and doing it through consensus, which also takes a bit of time because you can't sort of immediately say, right, this is what we need to do and let's get on with it. It does take quite a lot of discussion. And I think a good example of that recently has been the fact that we have then published sector strategies. So those sector strategies were published at the end of last year. They are written by the sector board. They are very much the sector board's view in terms of where the sector should be going. And there's an individual one for each one. So there's a beef and lamb sector strategy, obviously, and the primary objective agreed there was we need to rebuild trust in farmers and improve the efficiency and reduce audit burden. And there's a number of other areas which I can go into more detail if you want.
I think that's been a really good opener. So, Rob, you'll meet and greet a lot of farmers on a weekly basis. What's the viewpoint of farm assurance now compared to what it was 2 years ago?
I think the viewpoint currently is pretty similar than it was 2 years ago, really. Everyone you speak to is just sort of really waiting on the outcome of the review. And you mentioned that one, Philippa. Is there any time scale on that one, when we're likely to see the full outcome of it? Or is this more of an ongoing process?
So the Farm Assurance Review was published, as I said, at the beginning of last year. It made 9 strategic recommendations.
Sorry,
and within
when I say the review, I really mean the implementation of the review.
The implementation of the review. So I think the implementation of the review and all the work streams that Red Tractor's doing, there are lots of different things that we're doing that we'll do it at different speeds. So in terms of the actual standards review that we're going through, which is a really detailed standards review, every single standard. By the time you look at in beef and lamb, the beef and lamb standards and audit points, I think it's 369 in total. The technical advisory committee is going through those line by line. So Neil has the joy of being on that technical committee going through that line by line. And Jude Capper, who obviously is very involved in the MBA as well as the vice chair, is actually the chair of that technical advisory committee. And similar to the sector boards, that committee has representatives from the whole supply chain. We're doing a really rigorous review of the standards, and they should be out for consultation towards the end of this year. But I think it is important that that is not the only piece of work that we are doing. So firstly, we have absolutely committed. One of the main strategic recommendations was to improve communication with farmers. That's something that we and the board feel very strongly and are committed and have committed to do that. We've significantly increased our resource in terms of communication and to be a lot more transparent. We're out engaging with farmers at farmer events. We're delighted that we've got a stand at Beef Expo at the end of this month. That's just one example of us coming out and about and talking to farmers. We want to listen directly to farmers, hear their feedback, hear their ideas. There's a number of different other things that we're doing from a communication and an engagement perspective. But when we listen to farmers, and the Farm Assurance Review was quite clear about this as well, there are some significant opportunities to reduce audit burden and improve the process. We don't have to wait for the Standards Review to do that. As Red Tractor, we have made some significant changes to our systems. When Farm Assurance was first set up, so let's go back to the old Fabble days, the traditional way of doing farm assurance was that there was a set of standards, an inspector goes down the drive, inspects every farm to all of the standards once every 18 months. That is something that we recognised probably 8-9 years ago. It needs to be more adaptable in the future. So for those farmers that wish to take up the opportunity, we've developed a portal. I hear it all the time. Farmers really don't like paperwork. They really don't, not surprisingly, want to be out and about farming, looking after the animals. And the paperwork is a bit of a burden. And the last thing they want to be doing is spending time around the kitchen table showing the inspector all their paperwork. So we developed a portal a few years ago, 5 years ago. What we have done is we've made improvements to that portal over the last 12 months in light of farmer feedback, whether that's functionality that means that it's easier to upload documents, it can now provide reminders. And we've got some farmers that are using it week in, week out to keep things up to date. It's not necessarily something that you have to use just before your inspection. And more recently, in the last few months, we've also made changes to the portal functionality where farmers can now, if they want to, start taking photos of tasks rather than recording, I've just washed out my trailer or whatever, actually being able to take a geostamp photo, upload it straight to the portal there and then, don't have to worry when you come in from a day's work, I've got to sit down and remember to write this down. So what we're trying to do is improve that process as much as possible and to listen to farmers as to how we can improve that even more. So Rob, back to your question, it's not just about the Standards Review. Yes, that's a massive and really important piece of work, but we're constantly also looking at how we can improve communication and also reduce audit burden and make it as efficient as possible for farmers.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. But the review was broad brush. It wasn't just on standards. I mean, I can't remember exactly. There was it 67 or something recommendations, and I read it at the time, and I thought, gosh, this is a breath of fresh air. And it was going to be a change of philosophy, to be honest. And I hope that every one of those proposals, or not proposals, they were demands, I believe, instructions in the review. Are we going to see every one of them implemented?
So what Red Tractor has done since it was published is that we have responded at the time as to how we're going to address each individual recommendation. So on our website is all, I think it's 59 recommendations, and there's a Red Tractor action next to each one of those 59 recommendations. We have provided an update every 2 months as to how we're doing with that. Some of the recommendations were relatively easy for us to implement very quickly. Others, we have, for example, reviewed our policy on standards, and we've improved the portal, as I've said, and also our communication strategy. So from a Red Tractor perspective, we've been very transparent about how we have responded and where we have taken action and where some things will take longer. It was an independent review, as you know, and the sponsors of the review, which was the farming unions and AHDB, then asked David Llewellyn, who is the lead commissioner, to do 2 reports on progress. They didn't want it to just sit on the shelf and nobody see how has the review been responded to by all the parties, because it wasn't just farm assurance schemes that some of these actions were for. Some of these actions were for the supply chain and the farming unions and for AHDB as well. David Llewellyn has been tasked with doing a progress report. So he published a progress report in October, and we've all submitted to his final progress report, and I understand that that will be published next week. So in that report he will be explaining how the various people that have been given actions have made progress. But as I said, Red Tractor's been very transparent about its progress, and that's all available. We've got a dedicated page on our website to show what we've done and how we've been addressing the recommendations.
So do you think at the end of it, Red Tractor will be a sort of philosophically different place? I mean, the big old criticism historically that Red Tractor just became a stick to beat the farmer with. So hopefully at the end of this review, it'll be much more communicative and much more supportive of farmers. Do you see a change in attitude?
So I would hope, and I mean, again, perhaps ask Neil and Ben who've been involved. I would say that our commitment to listen has been very genuine, and we're doing that either through our sector boards and TACs, but also directly with farmers. So, for example, when we published the sector strategies, we had an open invite to all of our members to feed back on their thoughts on the strategies. We will continue to go through lots of rounds of consultations. So I think our commitment to openly listen is a change, and our commitment to improve that communication. I think we have, a large proportion of the people that work for Red Tractor are have farming backgrounds. We've also always been very committed to British agriculture. Perhaps that's not come through, but we really hope that by directly engaging that is coming through. And yes, there's always room for improvement. So the constructive feedback and the Farm Assurance Review has been an opportunity to take stock, listen, reset our relationship with farmers, and collectively and collaboratively do what's best for British farming and food. That's what we're all trying to achieve. I think we've all got a common goal there.
Yeah. I mean, the barometer with the farmers will be membership, won't it? I mean, I know at one time, going back to the Greener Farming Initiative, which is a thing of the past, farmers were leaving hand over fist. I don't know, how's your membership number rolling at the moment? Are people becoming keen to get back involved with Red Tractor, or is the membership still falling away?
No, I don't think the membership's falling away. I think obviously what is challenging in terms of monitoring that is that the whole farming industry is changing as well, in terms of, you'll know, Rob, from your daily contact with farmers, and how, farmers that are still farming now compared to 3 years ago that are coming into the market. I think what is really important is that farmers decide to be Red Tractor because it's giving them market access. The purpose is to give everybody, including farmers, value in doing what we do. Ultimately it's the farmer's decision as to whether it achieves that or not.
Yeah.
If I may ask, as we've gone round quite a lot of maybe higher level stuff, and just to get a direct answer, what locally, what are the gripes, if there are any, of course, but what do people say to you that they don't like, and see if we can get a reason teased out of some of those.
Well, there's you can't narrow it down to one thing. There's multitude of reasons why many farmers just don't want to be farm assured. From not providing a premium. I mean, you start with the guys that I come, the guys which are Red Tractor, Farm Assured, are those that just have to be to gain market access because they're supplying a retail supermarket, supplying abattoir. Once you start to drop outside of those guys, obviously the milk boys, but we're talking beef and sheep here tonight. Once you come out of those guys which are supplying a major supermarket, the chaps selling the stores under 26 months or under 32 months, the chaps selling the sturks, the wean calves, the bus calves, a lot of the fellows selling the sheep, they don't want to go near it really for the increased workload, and historically and well, still to a certain extent, some rather onerous inspectors probably not doing the job they ought to. I had one comment this week that an inspector, he wanted to know how many sheep we sold and cattle we sold. None of his business, a bit of a trading man. the chap was only being nosy. He didn't want to know about the broken needle plan or the rat poison plan. He was just having a good nose round. But that's the problem with the inspectors rather than Red Tractor itself. I must say that I think the phone call has slowed up in terms of people ringing up saying, "Oh, Rob, do I need to be fabled?" At one time, it was just constant, absolutely constant, and that's why I was interested to know, Philippa, whether the drop-off in membership had sort of plateaued, levelled out, and whether you'd seen any uptake. And my reply to them is basically, if you're selling fat cattle, yes, I'd prefer you were. They don't have to be, because you've got the butcher boys and the feeding men, which will buy cattle to take on. They're not so worried. And on the lamb front, there are other other outlets apart from the supermarket. So the sheep boys aren't so beholden. Export and halal, they're not worried at all. But outside of that, I'd have a bit of a job to persuade a lot of my chaps to become farm assured. They just don't want to know.
One of the things that we're doing in order to listen to farmers is that we are doing more sort of farmer survey type work, so that we actually hear and listen to that, and whether that's post assessment. So Rob, you talk about people's individual comments around the assessor. Every Red Tractor farmer has the opportunity to feed back after the assessment. We're working hard constantly, really, to train the assessors. The assessors, it's really important that the assessors are people that understand farming and have
They're your public face.
Come from a farming background, and do that. And I think generally those post-assessment surveys are rating the assessors well. I think we've seen quite a significant change, and I'm talking over 15 years. And I think sometimes I think, and we're all like this, aren't we? If we have what we consider to be a bad experience, it stays in the mind for quite a long time. And so for that reason, we've got assessors who are getting really good feedback from farmers. I'm hearing from farmers often that actually they were really helpful this time, really understood farming. That's not to say that some people will have different views about the assessors. That's it's really important that we take that feedback on board. If anybody has any concerns about an assessor, Red Tractor is always here to listen to that. We'll fully investigate it. But generally now at the moment we're getting 85% of the people that fill in that survey are providing us with much more positive comments than perhaps they were, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago.
I mean, the other things I get, two major things, with those people that are farm assured, a lot of them are guys that were back in, you mentioned Fabble, and I remember going out with one sheet of paper, which had, I think, 26 questions, one down the front and a few on the back. The most onerous one was, do you feed fish meal? Why Fabble was introduced back in the day. Farmers, it was a very basic scheme, and a lot now feel that it's become so complicated. A lot I get comment that they just like to go back to a basic scheme which covers legal standards, British legal standards, something you can stick a Union Jack on, or a picture of St George on a horse or whatever. Because now, if you are Red Tractor, one of the arguments early doors was, become Fabble, because it will be one scheme that supplies everybody. But that day's gone, unfortunately. Now, you can be Red Tractor, but if you sell to M&S, you've still got to do an M&S audit. If you sell to Tesco, you can do a Tesco's audit, or Waitrose audit, or whoever. Whether Red Tractor went back to just being the legal standards, this is the argument that's put to me, and then, if M&S want other things done, and they're prepared to pay a premium, then the farmer will do the M&S audit. That in the early days, Red Tractor, it used to be, 10p a kilo premium if you were Red Tractor. Well, these days, there just doesn't seem to be any premium directly associated with Red Tractor. They feel that they've lost value through Red Tractor, lost value in their product. If Red Tractor just went back to basics, just went back to legal standards, they then hopefully would be able to achieve a premium again by then going on to do the M&S audit or the Tesco audit or whatever other one.
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion about that, and a lot of discussion about what the right structure is, and certainly from a Red Tractor perspective, we certainly don't want to put farmers in a position where they are not able to achieve a premium for a particular customer. We need to balance, and I say we, the industry, need to balance that with being able to deliver it in the most efficient way possible for the farmer. So obviously in the very early days with Fabble, the concern was that every different customer is going to send a different inspector down the drive and have a different set of standards. So it's about having that framework that provides the balance between being able to demonstrate due diligence, get market access through a single inspection, but also being able to achieve the potential for premiums for specific supply chains if they're able to. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about as well is that, the other value of Red Tractor and Farm Assurance to the wider industry is that consumer confidence in British beef. And we, as an industry, your industry is acutely aware of the challenges that you face if that consumer confidence is knocked significantly. And that's really important. It's not a value that you can put necessarily in pounds and pence particularly easily. But having that confidence and that confidence that consumers have that British beef is safe, that is good quality, is really important. Because ultimately what we all want is we want British consumers to be buying British first, don't we?
The counter to that would be and I've had it put to me that, the consumer is confident in British standards, not necessarily Red Tractor standards. The over and above doesn't buy any more confidence. That confidence is already established by the legal British standards that we're producing under. Do you get involved at all in speaking to government or lobbying? Because the big argument for assurance, the counter argument for assurance, is that, at the moment we're producing our beef to good British standards or Red Tractor standards, whichever one you want to boast about, but imports are coming in at much lower standards. Do you get involved at all with speaking to government or speaking to retailers and saying, look, hang on, you're undermining our home producers with a product of a much lower standard?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Wherever we can highlight that, we will. And we'll highlight that both to government. We'll also highlight that to consumers. So, the fact that Red Tractor has a voice with consumers gives us an opportunity to highlight that to consumers and to highlight to consumers the reason why they should be buying British. So, that is really important. If we're going to protect this industry and this British industry, the consumer needs to understand that. And we have a part to play in that in terms of highlighting that to them and highlighting. So it's bringing that. So we've been doing quite a lot more in the last year where those opportunities have been there to really, when that opportunity arises, to use that platform to highlight to consumers. Wouldn't necessarily just happen in this sector, but for example, in the chicken sector, this whole discussion around chlorinated chicken, we will absolutely come out on the front foot and talk about this is why you should buy British because of the standards here.
And Philip, if I may ask, so we have these discussions with retailers about imported product, because we have them too, and they don't always go very well. But I guess that they somehow, especially those with major shareholders, have got to evidence also the standards of the food that they're importing.
Yes, absolutely, they do. And I mean, in this sector, you'll be aware that AHTB did a piece of work, independent work on standards, on how British Red Tractor assured standards compared to your main competitors. So whether that's Bull Beer in Ireland, Australia, and did that sort of factually based piece of work and that evidence. I think, we have to be mindful that our competitors are not sitting on their laurels. They are looking at ways in which they can either demonstrate that they're meeting our standards or in some cases exceeding our standards. So we, unlike perhaps in the 90s when we were the lead pioneers as far as assurance is concerned, actually, our competitors are doing that as well. But AHDB have done that piece of work. They've identified where British standards are stronger. Of course, we have to get the balance right between having standards that give the consumer a reason to choose British over imported, whilst not also making our own domestic market uncompetitive. And that's the fine balance that we all have as an industry, isn't it? Is to give them a reason to buy and why we're different, but let's not make ourselves so expensive that the consumer can't afford it.
No, absolutely. James, you're farm assured.
Yeah, we are. I think probably the first thing I should say is I think that farm assurance I think it's a great thing. The theory of farm assurance is fantastic. We're food producers at the end of the day. Every farmer out there, I would encourage to be farm assured because it does set a standard. However, I would be wrong of me to sit here and say that it's perfect. And I think we can all say that.
And I wouldn't say that either.
Exactly. And following on from especially what Rob has said, back when we had our first podcast with Cammy Wilson, I remember Cammy saying that, I think it was David Wheatley from Petty Peonies on Instagram had said that he felt that demonstrating that you did the paperwork was more important than demonstrating that you did the actual work. And I think that's probably where some of this farmer confidence has come from. You mentioned how you sort of rebuilt trust within the consumers. And I do think the Red Tractor is fantastic at what it does from a consumer point of view. I think a lot of consumers, they see the adverts on the telly, they see the products on the shelf, and they're there and they think, brilliant, that's a really high quality product. But you've also, in that process of building the consumer trust, have lost the farmer trust quite a lot. And what do you think it is that's lost it, from your point of view, and how do you feel you're going to regain that?
So I don't disagree. We've heard loud and clear that that our farmer trust has been dented. Interestingly, I would say probably 8 years ago, farmers were telling us, consumer doesn't understand what retractor means. You need to focus all of your efforts in promoting to the consumer. And Jim Mosley, the CEO, is retiring now, got us on television and those TV that James, you've been talking about. But I think, in doing that, farmers over the last 5 years in particular have gone through really challenging times. And I think it's not a surprise that farmers are questioning everything. Farmers' trust in government has gone down, and are questioning and challenging everything. We've absolutely heard that loud and clear, over the last 2 years, as well as all the things that we're trying to do in terms of rebuilding that trust, reducing audit burden. I mean, I think we recognise that farmers we've got to do something that actually doesn't just say we'll do something, that we need them to feel the change. And ultimately that change is going to be felt either during an audit or when we look at the standards. One of the things that we're doing with the standards is really asking ourselves, are these standards practical and workable? Are we removing duplication where there's too much duplication? And can we justify each standard and explain each standard? And ultimately, from my perspective, I want to be able to explain each standard as to why it is a benefit to you as a farmer for doing this for your business. Not just because of that. Actually, what is the business benefit for doing this? So, for example, health planning. I know over the years, and if we think about where farm assurance has come from, it was obviously completely new, and there was a lot of guidance with farm assurance, giving farmers guidance on how to do things. So health planning is probably a really good example where, the health plan probably became very prescriptive. Because if I think back 15 years ago, if not more, when we said to a farmer, you need to keep a health plan, most farmers were saying, what's that? What does that look like? And so the assurance scheme became much more prescriptive because they were written in such a way to try and help farmers. What the TOC's been doing now is looking at that and saying, actually, we're in a different world. We've got the health and welfare pathway in terms of DEFRA. And actually, let's make that health planning more of an open discussion with the farmer and their vet about what is right for the issues that are on that farm. So hopefully that's an example of why we had a standard like we did, but actually nowadays we need to make it more meaningful and practical for the farming environment we've got now, not the farming environment we had 20 years ago.
Do you think the farmers need a bit of a helping hand then perhaps in being brought up to that standard? Because, you're saying there 20 years ago, but farming it's a little bit of a different ball game. We're not in this commercial world where things happen and everyone kind of moves along at the same pace. Perhaps I think a lot of the gripes when you find from a farmer's point of view is that they feel that you're probably trying to meet a standard that the British Retail Consortium put in there and that the governing bodies want, but the farmers there and I'm just producing beef like I did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and why do you now need to know where my rat bait stations are? Or why do you now need to know how many cattle I'm selling? Or do you think that the Red Tractor has a duty of care to try and bring farmers with them? as opposed to almost, because I think there's a lot of farmers that probably feel imposed upon.
Yeah, so I think a large part of that is the communication challenge. How do we explain why this standard is important? And I think what we're also looking at is how do we then present the standards in a way in which is sort of hits the mark for the farmer. I think what we've also got to recognise is that we've got lots of different farmers. So we will have some farmers that do need that extra help, whether it's with templates, whether it's extra guidance in terms of why am I being asked to do this. And then we'll have other farmers that actually don't need that at all, aren't interested in that, just, happily doing the things. So I think historically we've been very much a sort of one size fits all, whereas now we've got to be a bit more dynamic. We've got to think, there will be different farmers that need different help and support, whether it's directly from Red Tractor. We've got a lot of information on our website, but then in an effort to try and help farmers, but then of course that means that we've got a lot of information on our website and it's therefore quite difficult for some people to find it.
Yeah, and I think, we're talking about like imports, we've spoken about imports and processors, and obviously you can have processors that are Red Tractor farm assured as well. So is there...
Yeah, so we're a food assurance chain.
Yeah.
So I think it is important that farmers recognise they're not the only ones that are being asked to do this. There is actually an assurance scheme for auction markets, as Rob will know, assurance scheme for hauliers, meat processors, right the way through. That is really important if we're going to, reassure the consumer about the food at the end of that, if it's going through those multiple stages, but also really important for farmers. What's really important for farmers is if you're jumping through these hoops and meeting all these standards and demonstrating it all, you want to know that the rest of the supply chain is also upholding that and not doing anything to jeopardise what you've done, and certainly on the traceability side of things.
And then from an imports point of view then, because there'll be a lot of farmers out there who will say, well, we get imports from wherever, pick the country, and they can then go through a Red Tractor processing or farm assurance processing plant, and then can they then be put a Red Tractor on, and is that going to sit alongside a British produced at a higher standard? There'll be a lot of farmers then, that's a gripe that they have, and that's probably going to put a lot of farmers off being Red Tractor assured, isn't it?
So no food product can carry the Red Tractor logo if it hasn't been produced, and that means farmed, and in this case born, reared and slaughtered in the UK. So anything that comes in, imported, cannot carry the Red Tractor logo or claim. Yes, it can be processed in a plant, but that plant has to absolutely be able to demonstrate segregation, clear traceability. And one of the things that I think, some farmers might not be totally aware of is the amount of scrutiny that we do put in on that supply chain. So we contract, I think there's 9 traceability assessors. They turn up unannounced in processing plants across the whole food supply chain. And they do a full trace of product, not just where it was bought from the next step down the chain, all the way down the supply chain to make sure that it's Red Tractor assured farms. And at the same time, they will take a non-assured product and also make sure that it's properly supplied. So I think the traceability systems are under a lot of scrutiny, and we impose significant sanctions on that end of the supply chain if they're not meeting those standards.
And do you think that that's improved? Because I know that there was a video knocking around a few years ago now of someone who'd rang up, I think it was Aldi, about some flour, and they wanted to know where this flour had been produced. And Aldi said, oh, it's British or whatever. And they said, yeah, okay, but it should be traceable. So where is it actually, can you give me the farm name? And then I think they eventually found it was from the southeast, but that was it. Is that something now that's been improved? So could I find out the farm name if I wanted to know where my bag of flour had come from?
So in the same way, grain is the same as we know within the supply chains, it's a batch system. So any of you that have been into the big beef processing plants will know that animals are batched as they go in and they stay in that batch coding. So from our perspective, it's important to make sure that it's traced back to Red Tractor assured farms in that batch. So as long as all the farms in that batch are Red Tractor assured, then that whole batch can be described as Red Tractor. That's practical. It would be impossible to produce a bag of flour that was from one farm.
I think that's probably where people are maybe getting a little bit mixed up there, is they want to know where it comes from. Equally, like you say, imagine the computer system you have to put in place to find out exactly where your bag of flour comes from.
Yeah, and it would, and the cost it would add to the food supply chain.
Yeah.
But absolutely so it's why, interestingly, it is why some of the processors won't buy non-assured. Because then everything going in, 100% going in is Red Tractor assured, therefore they don't have the cost of segregating everything.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Is that because, obviously, going back to what Rob was saying earlier, he's in the auction marts, he's seeing people who are selling as stores who potentially are not Red Tractor farm assured. It's not in their interest, it's just more paperwork, but they're probably not seeing a premium because they can go onto a finisher who is Red Tractor assured and it sits there for 90 days and obviously, gets the box ticked and away it goes. But is that then where your premium comes from? Because you'll hear a lot of farmers will say, well, I don't get anything. I'm not getting an extra p per kilo because I tick these boxes. The guy down the road, he's selling in the same place as me and I'm not getting any premium. Is that really where because you build a bigger market, because you've got processors who are willing to take it, is that where your premium comes from?
Yeah, so it's market access, and if you're not assured, then there is there will be a discount by the processors. So if the processors end up buying animals, and Rob, you would know this, I'm sure, that they then find out are not assured, there is a significant financial discount.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, in some ways, I think the price would be better to reflect that you got a premium. Because at the minute, it doesn't reflect the discount, but it would be better that would probably help farmers see the value in it a little bit more. Do you not think?
Yeah, the market is challenging, isn't it, in terms of price and where the price goes. I mean, AHDB used to publish, and again, Rob, you'll know more about this because it was auction market data, wasn't it? They used to publish assured versus non-assured pricing in auction markets.
Yeah, I mean, if you're selling a supermarket spec steer and you're not Fabble, you're not going to make as much if you're 29 months. But if you're selling a sweet little butcher's heifer, the butcher will outbid the supermarket, so there's a premium that way. It's very much a supermarket supply chain vehicle. Yes, there used to be a distinct premium. It's sort of par for the course now, and that's one of the gripes which comes back from the farmers. Every time the supermarket wants a little bit more, they don't pay a little bit extra to me. They just bolt it onto the Fabble inspection and get it for nothing. And that's the difficulty that you've got, is how you demonstrate you're getting a premium for the farmers, because it sort of, the demands become the norm. And that's one of the arguments for, if it were just basic British standards, that's Red Tractor. And then if Mr. Tesco's, Mr. Sainsbury's, Mr. whoever else wants to pay something else, they have their own inspection and then pay a premium for the farmer going through that inspection.
Yeah, and I've heard that. I've also heard that before. I suppose the challenge we have there is that farmers are telling us they want to reduce audit burden, and yet that model's got multiple people going down the drive.
That's the world we're in at the moment, unfortunately, because the argument in the early days, and that's why I was whizzing around with my little sheet of A4 trying to get everyone up on Fabble, because look, if you do Fabble, it'll suit everyone. But that argument's gone. Those days are gone. People will accept if they want to supply a Tesco's abattoir, they'll have an audit from them. If they want to supply a Waitrose abattoir, they'll have an audit from them. The single audit argument, unfortunately, is gone. I
will say though, we're Marks and Spencer audited, and I will say that the first time we had that audit, it was an absolute nightmare because we literally went through the whole process again. It was Red Tractor, but for Marks and Spencers. Whereas now we do have the little bolt on. There was about 5 or 6 questions. We got rid of the duplication at the end, and it did make the whole thing a little bit more palatable. Granted, I did ask where my premium is, and I don't get one, but I do think it did make it a little bit easier. So there probably is a bit of improvement on that respect, from the farmer-facing point of view.
I think one of the challenges we've all continued to have about if an assurance scheme becomes, British legal standard, then people don't have to pay to be part of that now. And if it was the baseline, then people would have to pay to be part of that, where currently they don't. So I think there are many challenges with that. And I'm not going to mention retailers, but there are some of the retailer schemes which have got different variations to what Red Tractor is. So I could say they're not bolt-on. Some of them are a subtraction because their standards are a little bit less than Red Tractor. So Shored, what's your views perhaps of farm assurance? Are your sheep farm assured at home?
So I'm a bit ashamed to admit this, but we're not actually, because we sell store lambs and we've got relatively few ewes. I think I'm right in saying the Welsh Farm Assurance Scheme is a set cost regardless of how many animals you keep.
Yeah, that's the same for all the beef and lamb schemes.
Yeah. And so I've looked at it, I've intended to consider it, but we've never got around to doing it because commercially for us, it doesn't have an impact. I like to think, we maintain those standards at home anyway, and some of them probably being a smaller operator aren't relevant to us as well. Things like rodent control and stuff, like it's simply not an issue. The way we keep stock. So I can see both sides. I think the welfare and management side of things are obviously really important to me, and I think if we could assure those as a national standard, that would be phenomenal. But I can see that the access point can be challenging if it doesn't bring a commercial return to the business.
So if there's a penalty in many places, if you're not farm assured, and James has said this, I think technically there almost is a premium, but it's just not realised because so many people are farm assured at point of sale that you don't see it.
So I think if we were having this conversation in some of the other sectors, so what we have in this sector is there is a market for non-assured. In some sectors there isn't at all, and that is challenging because the sector, farmers will say, I have absolutely no choice. So whether you're, potentially, dairy farmers or let's say poultry farmers, in this sector there is a choice, and it's a business decision as to whether the farm becomes assured or not. And there are pros and cons on both sides. But I think there would be people in other sectors that are a bit jealous of this sector because you've got multiple options.
And those options sort of increase and decrease depending on market forces and market trends, I guess.
Whereas if you are assured, at least you've got the widest option possible.
Because one of my questions would be are we parking assurance a little bit as a sort of cream on the cake kind of approach, if you like? Are we appropriately managing the bottom end? Do we have the mechanisms in place to manage farms that couldn't achieve farm assurance standards for health or welfare reasons?
Well, your real concerns get picked up by the trading standards. That's their role.
Perhaps the government are looking at this with a health and welfare pathway visit becoming a legal requirement, so that every farm will need a vet's visit on an annual basis and some sort of health plan and a discussion with the vet on what's good, what's bad, and what can, if anything, needs to be improved. So that's coming down the road in England, and that will, I think it's really important as a sector that we, assure the public and anyone that's viewing or listening that our beef is produced to the very highest standard and is very safe to eat, and is currently worth more than what the processors are paying. But that's a different bit.
Right. Can I come back in with a few bits and bobs then? Because I've been listening with interest to all of that. And I've made some notes and I'm not quite sure where to start with them really. But perhaps start off with the unannounced inspection bit. So Philippa, you said that the slaughterhouses, the cutting plants will have an unannounced inspection. They'll just turn up and demand on this day. Now, farmers do not have an unannounced inspection. And I've got to say,
some do.
Some do. Right. I'm fairly glad that I have not had an unannounced inspection because whilst I think I do most of my stuff pretty well, there is, without doubt, some time spent the day before making sure everything is in order. So you're saying some farmers get an unannounced inspection? So
just to clarify that, so absolutely, processors get unannounced inspections from Red Tractor from a traceability perspective. And I mean, you'll be aware that some of the BRCGS inspections that they have are unannounced as well. The majority of Red Tractor farm inspections are pre-announced. They are pre-announced for practical reasons, mainly, in that it's just unpractical to be arriving on farms unannounced. And actually, the majority of farms are maintaining the standards and meeting the standards. So actually, it's not a tool that would be appropriate. It would add a lot more cost. It would be completely impractical and not necessarily needed to be appropriate. Having said that, it is a tool in our toolbox. Particularly, we have something called a risk-based approach in our probably higher risk livestock sectors, pigs, poultry and dairy. So that risk-based approach means that poorer performers, farms that perhaps historically have had compliance issues, and particularly around key reputational areas, are then subject to going on an unannounced inspection programme. The farmer knows about that, so they know it's coming, but they just don't know when. And actually they have to pay more for it because they have to cover the cost of that inspection. But it's very much a targeted approach, and it's in order to try and make sure that that compliance is maintained in that area. It's not something that we've introduced in beef and lamb, but I think as part of the sector strategy, what we are looking at is not necessarily unannounced, but actually could there be different inspection frequencies considering what the compliance history of the farm is like. So that's an area that we're looking at.
So that
was
was
a
the
point.
next point.
Sorry.
No, Rob. So that's the next point because it plays into what my first one was, which was, so we're at a position where you've already said, like most farmers are passing, are complying here. So this is good. And we have discussed at board level, in that case, for those who have such successful audits, is it not possible to make these audits further apart and actually to maybe increase the frequency for those people who are having some failure points or something like that? And we have discussed that. Do you want to just say how that discussion went, what you felt the outcome was?
So that's absolutely something that the sector board has said they want to look at. So clearly we have to look at the practicalities of that, because you have to then define what you mean by the different categories and how people fall into them, what evidence you're going to take in order to categorise the farm, and then what type of oversight do you need of that farm. Now, it's not just about the frequency of the physical inspection, because nowadays you can have oversight in different ways. And therefore, we need to look at that in the round in terms of, actually, could it be that they still get a visit, but that's a much shorter visit because actually it's only coming to look at the livestock. It's not going to look at the records because the history around record keeping or the records are on the portal, whatever, means that that farm can be dealt with in a different way. I think we have to, in all of that conversation, which is absolutely what we're looking at, as well as the standards review. Obviously, the standards review gives us the basis upon which to do that. What we also have to look at the practicalities of doing that, and bear in mind that it's about consumer confidence, and consumers, we know that consumers are concerned about animal welfare. So I think if we were to say, for example, okay, we've got a really good performing farmer, we don't need to go and inspect for, let's say, 4 years. Is that really acceptable that we haven't seen the livestock themselves in 4 years versus actually a visit that only looks at the livestock, double checks that everything's okay, which I'm sure, and actually the majority of farmers that I talk to are very proud of their livestock. Actually, they really want to show their livestock to inspector, to anybody. So I think we can find, we can, I think farmers are proud of that, and they want to show off their livestock. And I think if we were to say to consumers some farms aren't visited for 4 years, that might be a little bit difficult to sell. But then on the reverse, you can then have this idea of actually more scrutiny for poorer performers. We've also got other things so we have, we do implement what we call special conditions of certification on some farms, depending, what we found, whether that's more stockman training, if it's a welfare, if it's a handling issue or stuff like that. So we're in a different world to where we were 25 years ago with Fabble. Fabble, it was very much set of standards, inspection, come back in 18 months' time. We've moved on as an industry, as an agricultural industry, and we need to make sure that assurance is adaptable and continues to deliver, but it will be in different ways for different farmers.
So further to that then, taking that argument one step further, if you have farmers that are doing well time after time after time, there is this concept of earned recognition. So is there a way, therefore, because Red Tractor is a higher standard than no assurance, so these farmers are reaching this higher standard and are reaching it consistently and reaching it well, therefore there is no need for another government agency to come down the road and start pouring through your ear tags and the time-consuming pain in the bum things that they do, which actually are wasting everybody's time for those farms who are doing the job well and already showing they're doing it well.
Absolutely. I mean, I've spent a lot of time over the last 15 years talking to government agencies about earned recognition, and we have a really good relationship with the Food Standards Agency around earned recognition. But obviously, the Food Standards Agency is only one regulator that covers farm regulation. You know, you've got APHA, you've got Environment Agency, you've got RPA, and you know, it's fair to say that those discussions have been challenging. I think if we can have better evidence to show that, then absolutely we'd be knocking on the door. But it has been challenging having those conversations. And even the Food Standards Agency, who've gone globally and shown other food safety regulators how Red Tractor works and how we work in partnership on earned recognition, and are telling other regulators, and we've spoken to those other regulators, it's a shame that our domestic regulators in other areas can't see the benefit. But we'll continue to try and persuade.
All right, so my next one, and I can let someone else have a go if they need to, or I can keep on a roll because I've got a whole list of this. So my next one is, if Red Tractor food is safe and ethical, why increase standards?
So it depends what you mean by increased standards, to be perfectly honest. I mean, our standards have changed in 25 years. Legislation has changed in 25 years. I would say the legislation has been the primary driver for the change in the standards. You know, because I was involved in Fabel in the end of the 90s, I know how the legislation has, changed. So that's one reason why they've changed. I think the other area is where the industry has looked at codes of practice. So health planning is a good example of that, isn't it? 25 years ago, Fabel standards didn't even talk about health planning. So when people talk about increased in standards, I think the standards have changed. But back to James's point, I think where we have struggled is to explain why and what the benefit of those changes are. Something new has been interpreted as an increase and an increase in burden, whereas, you know, personally what I would hope is that actually something new, we can demonstrate why there's a value to doing this to your business, and that's the challenge that we have.
So I would like to now partially answer my own question, which would be, I would cite Medicine Hub. So for the uninitiated who might be listening, Medicine Hub is a concept really, although it's not a concept because it's functioning kinda, where we stick on Medicine Hub the medicines that our cattle have had during the year, as and when they have them. And this will allow us to demonstrate that our medicine use is low in the UK, and which is important when we're comparing ourselves to our competitors. And other competitors across Europe are currently having this by legislation, and we're volunteering it at the moment, and our data set isn't big enough. So I would possibly encourage Red Tractor at some point in the future to say, well, it would be really handy if all Red Tractor producers submitted their medicine data to Medicine Hub, or better still, ask their vet to do it for them so they didn't have the extra burden of work. And I think that would be really handy for reputational protection against our competitors. There are things that I would say there's a strong reason why standards should change and possibly be seen to be more onerous or increased, but actually very useful.
So I completely agree. There are changes, there are things that we can put into the Red Tractor standards at the request and consensus of the entire industry that it's the right thing to do, that could offset the threat of legislation. So urea is a prime example in another sector where the government looked like it was going to ban it. The industry basically said, look, actually, voluntarily, we want to do this through a voluntary, sort of industry voluntary way of doing this to actually demonstrate responsible use. You know, Medicine Hub is an example of that. Obviously, through the process of Red Tractor, it's really important that we get complete, full alignment to do that. And then I'm sure Red Tractor can, but as you know, Ben, those conversations have been ongoing for a little while. We need to get full agreement by all stakeholders.
I think we're on that particular subject. I think we are pretty aligned, actually, that there is a real value to this to the industry. I think it's a matter of when, not if, with Medicine Hub.
I think, Ben, you're right. There's a real value with that, especially if Shonid's peers are the ones that submit the data, so the onus doesn't come back on the farmer if it's done by the vet. And it may well be that challenges on this are nearer than we think. If it becomes if it's legislated in the EU and we need an SPS agreement or want an SPS agreement, it might be nearer to us than what we actually think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
Sorry, just let me beg your pardon, Philippa. I know this, we're here to interview you, but this is a really important point. If we wait for the legislation before we submit this data, then who's going to be holding the data? And if you don't like the idea of DEFRA or APHA holding your data, you would much rather it was held by someone independent that you trust, maybe say like AHDB, then now's the time to get your data on there. Because later on, what they do with it, who knows? They might use it as a stick to beat us with and say, actually, even if you're using minimum amounts of antibiotics, you need to reduce your antibiotic use. And what would that do to our welfare arguments? So I would urge all farmers to encourage their vets to stick their medicine data on Medicine Hub now and not wait for Red Tractor, but hopefully Red Tractor, we can get that little nudge along the line as well. So beg your pardon for interrupting, Philippa.
No, that's okay. I think those are really good examples of where if the industry feels that Red Tractor is the right vehicle to help the industry do those types of voluntary things, then absolutely. I think the ask from Red Tractor is that the industry collectively then communicates to the farmers, because otherwise, the danger is that farmers just see that as Red Tractor coming up with another thing that we want that we want farmers to do. And I think urea is a good example of that. So we were very clear that we were asked by the industry to do this. The communication was led by the farming industry, and actually I think even DEFRA have been surprised by how the impact that it's actually had, and it's a good example.
And rodenticides is another one there, isn't it? So this wasn't a Red Tractor idea. This was something that was pushed by the rodenticide industry because of their fear of having these chemicals taken out of their arsenal if they're not used effectively.
You're absolutely right, it was. There's the campaign for responsible use of rodenticides, so CREW, and there were elements of putting that into farm assurance. I think that is an example of where it hasn't necessarily delivered the outcomes that perhaps was wanted in terms of the figures around wildlife and rodenticides, which is why they've now moved to requiring everybody, even if you're assured, to have a certificate of competence. From a Red Tractor perspective, that's disappointing that we haven't continued to do that. But if the evidence isn't there, it's quite difficult to argue any differently.
I did my certificate of competence the other day, and I'm glad that I did.
So did my husband.
Right, so I figure I was being responsible. I learned stuff. I learned how to be more responsible. I also learned that 100% of owls that are post-mortemed have rodenticide traces in them. That is not a good look. And obviously it's not farmers, not just farmers. You can go and buy rodenticides down your local hardware store or whatever and throw them out in your garden or whatever. But we've got a part to play in this, haven't we?
Yeah.
So I think we've just seen a classic case of how we could talk about farm assurance forever. But unfortunately, we can't talk about farm assurance forever. For those that want to continue the discussion, Philippa is on one of our panels at Beef Expo at Milton Mowbray Market on Saturday the 30th of May. And as part of that, Philippa will be part of the group that's debating the value of home-produced food. So I encourage everyone to come along. I want to thank everyone for participating in an open and honest conversation. As ever, there'll be more questions that people want to ask later, but you can't because it's a podcast, so you can't submit questions. This is the end, and we might come back to farm assurance at a later date. So I would just want to thank everyone again for attending, being open and honest, and I think it's been a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.